The silence of the English dawn was shattered, not by an air raid siren, but by a voice sharp enough to cut through the frigid air. "Who the hell laid a hand on my aircraft?" The words, explosive and raw, echoed across the snow-dusted tarmac of the airfield in December 1943. Flurries of snow drifted lazily around the formidable, battle-worn silhouette of a P-47 Thunderbolt, its dark green paint scarred and its metal skin still radiating the residual heat from a harrowing mission over occupied France. The man who owned the voice, Lieutenant Joe Ringo Haynes, stormed across the frozen ground, his leather flight jacket whipping around him like an angry flag. The cluster of ground crewmen froze in place, tools hovering over engines, their breath pluming in the cold. Near the massive tail section, one figure remained unfazed, not even bothering to look up from the complex innards of the engine, cowling he was meticulously working on, a wrench gripped firmly in his grease-stained hand. "That would be me, sir," replied the man, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of fear or apology. He was Sergeant Tom Kelly. She was begging for a little persuasion to stay in the air, wasn't happy about the conditions up there. Ringo's eyes widened with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Persuasion? You butchered the damn engine cowling. You cut it open like a tin can." "Just the cowling, Lieutenant," Kelly corrected calmly, finally looking up and wiping his hands on an oil-blackened rag. "Manuel reported she was running hot, dangerously so. I addressed the overheating. The problem is solved." The pilot's voice escalated, straining with the tension of a man who had just cheated death and now faced a new threat from his own side. "You have no authority to carve up a government aircraft. This isn't some broken-down tractor in a field." Kelly's response, delivered with an unnerving, placid certainty, brought an absolute stillness to the scene. "I suppose I just voided the warranty on a warplane, sir." For a single, suspended heartbeat, there was utter silence. Then a nervous chuckle escaped from one of the mechanics. But the attempted humor died instantly, suffocated by the grim reality. Everyone present understood the profound implications. Sergeant Kelly had not merely performed a risky repair, he had committed a court-martial offense. He had blatantly, deliberately, and physically violated the sacrosanct regulations of the United States Army Air Forces. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried a heavy reputation. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, but often said with the derisive tone one would use for a flying milk jug. It was colossal, heavy, and notoriously sluggish, especially at lower altitudes. It lacked the nimble climb rate to intercept a Messerschmitt Bf-109 and couldn't match the tight turning radius of a Focke-Wulf FW-190. To the young men who entrusted their lives to its cockpit, the Thunderbolt felt less like a fighter and more like a death sentence. "Every time I strap into this thing," a pilot had been overheard muttering just days before, "I feel like I'm trying to dogfight while riding a flying safe." Even German intelligence reports mockingly dismissed it as an aircraft better suited for hauling cargo than for engaging in aerial combat. The sleek, predatory lines of the Luftwaffe's fighters embodied lethal grace, while the Thunderbolt simply bludgeoned its way through the air, a brute force instrument that seemed tragically inefficient. But Tom Kelly saw a different truth. He saw untapped potential. He had spent his youth under the vast, unforgiving Oklahoma sun, a sun of the Dust Bowl, where machinery was a matter of survival. He had learned to fix tractors that rattled apart and pick up trucks that coughed and died, machines that were never perfect, but were always made to work. In his eyes, the Thunderbolt wasn't a failure of engineering, it was a magnificent challenge. "The Army calls her a fighter," he once confided to a fellow mechanic. "But that's missing the point. She's not a fencer's foil, she's a sledgehammer. You just need to learn how to swing her properly." The official directive from headquarters, when confronted with the chronic overheating issues, was bureaucratic and simple. Ground the aircraft. cease combat operations until the correct, factory-approved replacement parts could be shipped from the United States. When Kelly examined the supply requisition logs, he let out a bitter, hollow laugh. 3 weeks for new ducting, he muttered to himself, the paper trembling in his hand. That's 3 weeks of bomber crews dying without escort. 3 weeks of good men not coming home because of a paperwork problem. That very night, long after the final engine had been silenced and the powerful floodlights bathing the airfield had been dimmed, Kelly remained in the cavernous hangar. The air was thick with the familiar, almost comforting smells of high-octane fuel, hot engine oil, and scorched metal. He climbed the maintenance ladder, a heavy flashlight clenched between his teeth, its beam cutting a solitary path through the darkness, and he began his illicit work. Each spark that flew from his hacksaw as he cut into the aluminum skin of the intake system was a potential charge of insubordination. Every metallic clang of his hammer and wrench echoed through the empty space like a pronouncement of his defiance. He was not motivated by a desire for recognition or glory. His driving force was a cold, furious determination to keep the men he served with alive. The hours bled away. When the weak winter sun finally began to lighten the eastern horizon, the other mechanics arrived to find him still there, slumped against the massive landing gear, his eyes bloodshot and raw from exhaustion, his hands chapped and bleeding. He had surgically reshaped the engine cowling using his own personal tools, rerouted the critical air ducts, and skillfully welded a custom-made baffle from scrap aluminum he had salvaged from a wrecked British Spitfire. The result was visually jarring, an ugly, asymmetrical bulge grafted onto the side of the fighter, making it look as if a piece of farm equipment had been crudely fused to a cutting-edge warplane. But the data was irrefutable. When he hit the starter, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine did not merely start. It roared to life with a new, clean, and hungry sound that no one on the base had ever heard from a Thunderbolt before. The temperature gauge needle held perfectly steady, well within the safe zone. No ominous whisks of smoke, no smell of boiling coolant. Kelly leaned his weary body against the cool metal of the fuselage, a profound, exhausted smile touching his lips. "You're not a jug," he whispered, almost affectionately, to the machine. "You're a bull, a damned angry bull." The following morning, Lieutenant Ringo Haynes, fueled by a mixture of desperation and a flicker of faith in the sergeant's genius, climbed into the cockpit of that very modified aircraft and led a flight over the English Channel. What transpired in the skies over Europe that day would begin the transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt from a mocked liability into a legendary warrior, and it would cement Tom Kelly's reputation as the most dangerous kind of soldier, the one who possessed the brilliance and the courage to ignore the rules in order to achieve victory. Before Kelly's unsanctioned intervention, the P-47 was the subject of grim jokes in every pilot's briefing tent across England. It was the plane nobody wanted, the cumbersome giant that couldn't keep up. The sleek German fighters could dance around it, outclimb it, and outturn it with seeming ease. The Thunderbolt simply muscled its way through the air, a testament to raw power hamstrung by flawed design. Even the enemy held it in contempt, with Luftwaffe pilots reportedly referring to it with dismissive nicknames. But to Tom Kelly, that immense, brute force power was the entire point. He had been forged in the crucible of the Great Depression, in a world where nothing was ever new and everything had to be repaired, adapted, and forced to work long past its intended lifespan. The tractors broke down daily, and the very wind sought to tear their world apart. When his family lost their farm, he didn't lose the ingrained habit of fixing what was broken. If it moves, it can fight, was his simple, steadfast philosophy. So, when the draft notice arrived and he found himself in the Army Air Forces, he looked upon the P-47's perceived flaws not as failures, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. He saw an engine of almost unimaginable power, wings strong enough to absorb devastating cannon fire and remain airborne, and a fuselage built with the resilience of a fortress. The problem, as he diagnosed it, was elementary. The engine was being systematically suffocated. The airflow was inadequate, a design flaw conceived on a drafting table thousands of miles from the brutal realities of combat. This fundamental clash between rigid regulation and desperate necessity defined the daily existence on that forward airfield. The 56th Fighter Group, operating under the demanding command of Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, was tasked with the critical mission of protecting the vulnerable Allied bomber streams. Yet they were trying to accomplish this with aircraft that seemed to be actively working against them. The official memos from headquarters emphasized strict adherence to technical manuals and design parameters. Kelly and men like him lived in a world where those manuals were often useless. He had studied the engineering texts enough to understand the theoretical limits of the aircraft, but he had also stood on the tarmac and watched young men die because those theoretical limits didn't account for the searing heat of a dogfight or the desperate strain of a high-altitude climb to escape flak. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. One morning, after a particularly brutal mission, a shot-up Thunderbolt limped back to base, its engine trailing a plume of oily smoke. As it taxied to a stop, the ground crew gathered around it in a silent, grim circle. The heat from the overheating engine had been so intense it had melted sections of the cowling and blown out the delicate seals on the turbocharger. "She wasn't just flying, Sarge." One of the younger mechanics, a man named Franks, said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She was dying, slowly, in the air." Kelly didn't offer any words of consolation. He simply stepped forward and placed a hand on the scorched and warped metal of the engine casing. He could almost feel the turbulence, the points where the life-giving air had failed to flow, the precise locations where the design had betrayed the machine and the man inside it. He knew with absolute certainty exactly what needed to be done. That night, as the entire squadron slept the fitful sleep of exhausted men, Kelly remained in the hangar, the solitary sentinel of his own private war against inefficiency. He began sketching his plan not on paper, but directly onto the hangar wall with a grease pencil. The diagram showed widened intake ducts, a completely redirected airflow path, and the specifications for a custom-made baffle that could be fashioned from the aluminum skin of a Spitfire that had been written off. The underlying principle was elegant in its simplicity. If the engine is a beast, you must feed it more air to keep it alive. To any commissioned officer or staff engineer, it was heresy. To Kelly, it was pure, unassailable logic. The jug's not a joke. He murmured to the empty hangar, adding one final decisive line to his drawing. "It's the finest hammer they ever built. All it needs is a man who knows how to swing it." And in that moment, Tom Kelly made the conscious decision to commit the one act that was drilled into every mechanic as unforgivable. He chose to break the laws of military protocol and the established laws of aeronautical engineering to save lives. The confrontation with his commanding officer was as swift as it was inevitable. The man stormed into the hangar, his face a mask of thunderous anger. "Sergeant Kelly, what in God's name have you done to that aircraft?" Kelly, standing at a respectful but firm attention, met his gaze. "I improved its performance, sir." "Improved it?" The officer barked, circling the modified P-47 as if it were a contaminated object. "You have mutilated government property. You have violated Section 42 of the Maintenance Code and a dozen other regulations. This is a court-martial offense." Kelly did not flinch. "With all due respect, sir, I may have also saved the lives of the pilots who have to fly it." The officer was about to deliver a furious retort when the hangar was suddenly filled with a deep, resonant, and shockingly smooth roar. One of the other mechanics, acting on a silent cue from Kelly, had climbed into the cockpit and started the engine. The R-2800 awoke not with its usual uneven sputter and cough, but with a clean, powerful, and confident thunder that vibrated through the concrete floor and into the bones of every man present. All conversation ceased. Every eye was locked on the instrument panel. The gauges told the undeniable story. Oil pressure was rock steady, engine temperature was perfectly cool, and there was no sign of the overheating that had plagued the aircraft for months. Kelly's brutal, unsightly modification worked flawlessly. The officer was visibly stunned, his anger momentarily displaced by sheer professional astonishment. "You are astronomically lucky this worked, Sergeant," he finally managed, though his tone had lost its edge. "But you will still have to answer to command for this." "Yes, sir," Kelly replied. "But perhaps we could test it where it truly matters first. Up there, in the sky where the problems occur." The test pilot was, unsurprisingly, Lieutenant Ringo Haynes. The man who had once been ready to strangle Kelly now volunteered to fly the illegally modified fighter. "If this thing comes apart and I end up in a field in France, Kelly," he said with a grim half-smile, "I'm going to be seriously annoyed." Kelly allowed himself a small smirk. "Understood, Lieutenant. Just don't stall her on the climb out. She's got a new temperament now. You have to show her you mean business." When Ringo took off, the entire airfield seemed to be holding its breath. The patched-together Thunderbolt, with its ugly bulge and mismatched metal, accelerated down the runway with a newfound urgency. Its wheels left the ground in a noticeably shorter distance, and it began to climb. Not with the labored, sluggish struggle they were all accustomed to, but with a powerful, aggressive ascent that carved a path through the low-hanging English clouds. The radio crackled to life, Ringo's voice laced with disbelief and exhilaration. "Temperature is steady at 15,000, now 20,000 feet. No spike. Kelly, you madman, she's smooth as silk. I've never felt power like this in a jug." A wave of cheers and applause erupted from the ground crew. Even the frowning commanding officer couldn't suppress a look of impressed shock. But Kelly's celebration was internal and quiet. He simply exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for months. He knew this success was not an end. It was the beginning of a much larger battle, a battle against the entrenched bureaucracy of a massive military machine. The true, ultimate test came not in a controlled flight, but in the fiery chaos of combat. In March of 1944, the 56th was assigned to escort a massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses on a daylight raid deep into Germany, targeting the industrial heartland around Hanover. The Luftwaffe was waiting for them in force. As the American formation crossed into hostile airspace, the sky erupted into a lethal ballet of twisting aircraft, tracer fire, and exploding shells. Back at the airfield, Kelly stood vigil, staring into the distant horizon where the sound of the engines had faded, his stomach a tight knot of anxiety. He knew his modification was being tested not by gauges, but by cannon fire and the brutal physics of aerial combat. The radio transmissions that filtered back to the command post were fragmented, chaotic, and terrifying. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high. I'm hit. I'm losing oil." Then a voice they all recognized. Ringo Haynes. "Engine's running hot. Wait. No, it's cooling down. It's holding. She's holding, Kelly. She's holding on the other side of hell." In the midst of the dogfight, Haynes's modified Thunderbolt performed miracles. It sustained a high-power climb that would have cooked a standard P-47's engine, allowing him to chase down and destroy a German FW-190 that had picked off one of his wingmen. When the aircraft began to return hours later, the relief on the ground was palpable. They came back scarred, holed by flak and cannon fire, some trailing smoke, but they were alive. Ringo taxied in, yanked open the canopy, and grinned down at Kelly, his face smudged with sweat and cordite. "She fought like she wanted to win," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "She never quit. I outclimbed 2 190s. Your bird is a masterpiece, Sergeant." The after-action reports provided the cold, hard data to support the emotional testimonials. Every single P-47 that had received Kelly's modification returned to base. 2 of the unmodified Thunderbolts on the same mission were lost, not to enemy fire, but to catastrophic engine failure. The evidence was incontrovertible. The response from headquarters, when it finally came, was not a congratulatory telegram, but a terse, official order. The field modification was approved for immediate standardization across the entire 8th Air Force. Kelly's court-martial offense had become official doctrine. In the weeks and months that followed, Kelly's influence spread far beyond his own hangar. His modification, jokingly referred to as the Kelly Fix by pilots and mechanics, was implemented on Thunderbolts across England. Bomber crews began to notice that their P-47 escorts were staying with them longer, fighting harder, and returning more consistently. German pilots, in turn, began filing confused reports of Thunderbolts demonstrating abnormal performance characteristics and unexpected endurance. Kelly was never officially credited in any manual. He received a formal reprimand for his initial actions, a necessary piece of paperwork to satisfy protocol, but was quietly told to continue his work. The greatest recognition came not from the military but from the manufacturer itself, a letter from Pratt & Whitney, along with a small monetary award, thanking him for his field insights that had led to improvements in the R-2800 engine's reliability. He never cashed the check, keeping it as a memento. The legend of Tom Kelly was not built on medals or public acclaim. It was woven into the very fabric of the P-47's legacy. It lived on in the stories told by veterans at reunions, where men like Ringo Haynes would raise a glass and say, "To Kelly, the man who taught a bull how to fly." It was etched into the small, unofficial wrenches painted below the cockpits of victorious aircraft. His story became a timeless testament to a different kind of courage. Not the courage of the charge, but the courage of the conviction to fix what is broken, to challenge failed authority, and to trust one's own hands and mind. It is the story of how one man, armed with nothing but a wrench, a brilliant intuition, and a profound sense of duty, helped a misunderstood machine breathe fire, and, in doing so, helped change the course of the air war over Europe. He was the mechanic who refused to let the rulebook cost lives, proving that sometimes the most important battles are won not in the sky, but in the quiet, oil-stained shadows of the hangar, by those who keep the angels of the sky aloft.